and welcome back to our second panel of the day. Good to see you again, Bianca. I think we're in for a treat, and I think there was a lot of teasing going on in the first panel, which we also addressed applications as well. And we're very excited to have now a panel looking at battery use cases, mobility versus stationary. So let's make it a bit, entertaining and fun. And maybe there's, we have a poll later on showing also what our LinkedIn community is thinking, where there's the biggest priority right now. But before we show this, I will pass it on to Bianca to introduce our two fantastic panelists today.
We absolutely have some powerhouse panelists for this session. So starting with Rajarshi Rashek Sahai. He is a renowned thought leader on smart cities, energy, transportation, and mobility. He has successfully led organizations in the automotive industry, spanning developing growth strategies for electric vehicles, electric and shared mobility systems, mobility as a service, and mobility venture capital investment. And this experience is both in emerging and developed countries around the world. He currently splits his time between venture capital and mobility with the Mobility Fund, and is also CEO of Beliti Electric's EMEA business, which is focused on the mass rollout of sustainable compact electric vehicles. We are also joined by Marek Kubik, and he is recognized as an energy industry thought leader and executive. His work focuses on accelerating the world's transition to sustainable energy, and Marek played an instrumental role in developing the first utility scale commercial battery energy storage project. He subsequently spent many years establishing and scaling up multiple clean tech businesses into market leaders. And today he is the founding member and managing director of the global leader in the energy storage tech space, Fluence. He leads their energy storage business, overseeing sales of Fluence storage products, services, and digital applications to utilities and project developers. Let's welcome our panelists. Hello.
Hello.
It is so lovely to have you both here. And I definitely don't, it's not an exaggeration when I say you're both powerhouse panelists. You have a wealth of knowledge, experience, and career behind you. So to start, we'd love to hear from each of you your thoughts on battery trends emerging in both the mobility and storage spaces, respectively. Marek, would you like to kick us off?
Sure, very happy to, Bianca. Thank you for the introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening for everyone tuning in around the world. So I have a couple of sort of slides that would support some of the opening statements I want to make, and yep, they've magically appeared on the screen. Thank you. So if we move straight on to the next one, just as a very short intro as to the perspective, I guess, that I would be trying to bring to this panel. Fluence, as Bianca mentioned in the intro, is an energy storage tech company. So we provide battery-based energy storage products, services, so i.e. standing behind them once we've built them in terms of performance and maintenance around the world. And we're also very heavily in the software and digital space. So both the grid edge controls of integrating all the different subcomponents into a working product, but then also increasingly the cloud-based stuff as well. So enabling the use of energy storage and flexibility assets, both for renewables and storage around the world. I won't go too much into this slide. It essentially just outlines that we're doing this in a lot of places around the world. So Fluence across those business lines is in 44 different countries, over 200 projects, and over 21.5 gigawatts of projects across that. So that gives me quite a breadth of different opportunities to talk about use cases right around the world. Given this is a pretty short opening set of remarks, I'm not going to go through all of them, and I thought I would just pick a handful. So there's 3 or 4 different ones that listeners may be already very familiar with or not. So if we go to the next slide, essentially one of the opening use cases for stationary energy storage in a lot of markets around the world is frequency regulation. So this could well be one that everyone is very familiar with already. Essentially using stationary batteries to respond very quickly and accurately to changes in grid frequency, which is more important as we get more variable renewable generation on the grid, or we have more variable demand. And this is where the interaction with the EV sector is really important. We can see big spikes in demand in localized areas. And batteries are an extremely good technology for managing those sort of imbalances on a second-to-second basis. So I always think this one's interesting because most people think energy storage is about storing energy. It's not really. It's about essentially flexibility and grid stability. And we've shown around the world batteries are very, very effective at this. And the project you see on the screen here is the fastest responding battery in the world in the Irish electricity market, which puts a very high performance premium on responding very quickly to frequency deviations, because the faster you respond, essentially the more stable the grid is. And this is something that's really enabling the instantaneous penetration of very high levels of renewables on the grid. Before we worry about 100% renewables over the whole year, we need to get to virtually 100% in real time. And that's only possible if you take the thermal plant off the system and provide the same stability and services that those thermal power plants have been providing in the past. So that's a really good primer. But if we move into the next slide, one of the biggest use cases that gets talked about, and particularly in the US market, is around peaking replacement as well. So we have a lot of around the world thermal peaking power plants that typically run only a small percentage of the year and only for a few hours at a time. And if you model that, there's a very significant percentage that can be immediately displaced by essentially battery-based storage, which is cheaper on an upfront basis, but also obviously doesn't have an ongoing fuel cost. So this is one of the most classic use cases that I think people do get quite easily. You basically can do things usefully with a battery the entire day on the grid, but essentially if you charge up in the middle of the day, typically when in a place like California there's a lot of solar, you absorb that solar and then you discharge it in the evening after the sun has set. That displaces the need to run thermal power plants, which are generally the least efficient on the grid and the most expensive to run. So this is a very popular use case, particularly in the US, but we're now starting to see it roll out in other markets. The third one is probably the most classic example. So if we move to the next slide, this is the one I think everyone thinks about when they think of batteries, or at least energy storage technology, which is quite simply pairing it directly with renewables. And it is definitely possible, and there are advantages of doing this. There are lots of different ways that you can optimize solar and storage together if you look at those particular combinations of asset class, but they essentially generally revolve around time shifting of the renewable resource. So similar to the previous example, with the slight difference that this is directly linked to the same site and the same grid connection. If you put in batteries at the same site of the solar facility that you're installing, you can actually get a lot more energy out of that same solar farm, because a lot of energy is typically clipped. You put in more DC panels of solar than you have AC capability to extract. But if you put in storage behind those same inverters, you can basically store that excess energy, which would have been clipped, and shift it into another time period. So that can actually improve the efficiency of the overall combination of solar and storage very effectively, and deliver more energy from any given site and any given grid connection. So moving on to the very final one, I wanted to pick one that's a little bit more unusual, or a little bit more emerging as well, because we think a lot about storage almost replacing thermal power stations on the electricity grid, and a lot of those are generation sort of use cases. But storage is not generation, right? It's an electron time machine. It essentially can shift energy in time. But the other aspect of it is the geographic aspect, and particularly as we add more renewables to the grid, and we're looking at generally places that are far away from demand centers. Quite often there is a trend of obviously distributed local, but there's also a trend of, for instance, large offshore or big solar farms. And getting energy from A to B when it's variable is pretty inefficient, and it takes a long time to build new infrastructure. So to build a new power line can cost tens of billions and take 10 plus years of planning. We frankly don't have that time to get to net zero. We have to move faster. And there are smarter digital solutions that are possible to make better use of the infrastructure that we already have. And the storage as virtual transmission, I think, is a really great example. You can see this on the right-hand side. Most power lines, for contingency reasons, don't use all of the lines that you actually see hanging from poles and wires. One is there as a backup for another, or providing redundancy so that we have a reliable grid. But you can basically put in batteries either end of the line, use that line to its full effect, and if one of those lines fails, the batteries basically kick in immediately and provide effectively the same level of reliability and stability to the electricity grid. So this one is one of the ones I'm most excited about, because it moves it away from thinking about storage as just generation, because it isn't, into it's an infrastructure asset class. To what other problems can you solve geographically and with sort of transmission and distribution infrastructure. So those are some of my quick flyaway thoughts on stationary storage. There's a lot more I could have gone into, but I'll hand it back to Bianca at this point, and look forward to the discussion.
Absolutely. I really like that comment about storage as an electron time machine. That's quite catchy. I'll be using that one. Now, over to Rajarshi. Could you please tell us your insights emerging in mobility? Really interested to hear them.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bianca and Marek. Great presentation. I do hope that we do get very sort of responsive storage, so that we don't have to often hear from even states like California that one shouldn't charge their electric cars on that particular day. I mean, disaster, but that's why we need storage. Back to the mobility scene, I guess this is really very interesting how Marek, for example, talked about choices, and mobility industry also is going through this transition. Electrification of mobility is one of the low-hanging fruits as we try and electrify various sectors in the economy. This is the lowest hanging fruit, so obviously it makes sense to go about it. But if you look at where we are right now, we are definitely enamored as a world with the so-called Tesla model. So, premium cars, high voltage architecture, fast chargers, that being the kind of global common. We have seen traditional OEMs also follow on those lines without too much of thinking, to the extent that everybody wants to go further premium and really keep on sort of making sure the households that can afford it would have fancy electric cars sooner than later. And I guess that's a very commendable goal. But what it also misses out on some of the challenges that we see as a world, as cities, as economies, where electrification is not just for the sake of it, but also because it solves real problems. Problems like tailpipe emissions, making our cities very difficult to live in. I mean, again, Marek's example of those those generators next to cities that come up once in a while and still add to the pollution. Same thing multiplied many million times over. Every single car adding to the choking of our cities, to even geopolitical and I would say balance of account concerns, where many economies are simply struggling to cope with the oil bill that they are getting. So electrification, to me, is therefore a much bigger goal. And here we are, I believe, missing some very obvious points. Good example. An average car in Europe emits something of the order of 90 grams CO2 per kilometer, whereas an average van does 150 grams. Actually, slightly more than that. But just to give you an idea of the scale, right? An average van goes about distributing stuff all day. The car actually sits in a house, or at best you take it to the office, back. So the kind of compounded impact of transport vehicles, delivery vehicles in our cities, the so-called urban delivery, is multiplicative. It's also oft neglected sector. We don't have good replacements to those small size vans that would still go around our city and solve for those electrification of the last mile. And I guess what has happened, the chip crisis, the whole batteries kind of faltering on the continuous receding scale of batteries getting cheaper, has actually caused OEMs to go further into the private premium. And I guess that's where we are missing a point. One thing that I'm trying to do with Ability Electric is to actually look at the Asian model, where you would have simple form factors like a tuk-tuk made into a van, still very robust, still very very regular from a homologation standpoint, but very, very versatile. And it is already proving itself in cities in Asia. We should look at how this can be, at least for the next 5 to 10 years, a solution that gives us instant gratification rather than waiting forever for OEMs to say, hey, you know what, we are done making enough expensive private cars. So that's really the focus area for me, Bianca, these days. And that's where I also see that there's a big opportunity, and the trend, if one were to say, will have to shift to that. There's too much of gravitation in that direction. Thank you.
Absolutely, and I completely agree with you. When we use the words energy transition, that's really focused on the developed world. When we're talking about developing countries, their terms we use there are green growth and green development, and how do we get them to live the living standard for hundreds of millions of people in a green way and not follow the pathways that the developed countries took that have led to many of the emissions that we're dealing with in the atmosphere today. So, we've sort of pitched this session as, mobility versus storage. And just to start on that, is there any competition in sort of the battery manufacturing supply chain between mobility and storage, or do gigafactories usually specialize in one or the other?
Want either one of us to take that first? I'm happy to give it a go. So, I mean, the fundamental chemistry, right, the building block of stationary energy storage system is lithium ion, and there are a few different subchemistries of that, the most popular of which are NMC, nickel manganese cobalt, and LFP, lithium iron phosphate. Those are the same building blocks that are generally being used in EVs as well. So at the cell level, you could call it competition. I mean, really, the EV sector is 90+% of the demand. See, Simon's battery is
exhausted.
So 90+% of the batteries that go into different things, there's consumer electronics, there's EVs, and there's stationary storage, are going into the EVs. So it's not so much competition as that the stationary storage industry piggybacked off the R&D trends, the innovation that was going into large-scale storage, and then took advantage of the same technology to be used in a different way. From that perspective, you could say there's competition, but actually, when you get further downstream, the cells are manufactured into packs, into modules in very different ways for these sectors. So you will see there's specialist gigafactories. You can't necessarily just take one gigafactory and use it in stationary storage if it's designed to build essentially the packs that go into electric vehicles. So maybe that gives a bit of color on the supply chain end of the spectrum. Rajarshi, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, I also wanted to add some points here. I guess one thing that I like about the mobility industry is how the mobility use case has become the predominant one in the kind of popular conversations. Like, people don't even realize the sheer volume of batteries that are needed in stationary, right? It's just everybody just thinks cars, EVs. And I guess that's something that really the sector can actually also learn from the mobility sector, that there has to be a clearer statement of such aggregated demand, all the way down from grids to providers, to eventually the kind of gigafactory promoters, that this is needed. and this is coming at us, and the same sort of urgency is needed. I think what's also not going to change is the challenge around critical raw materials, and in that sense, I do think that stationary has the potential to use alternative chemistries that would put lesser pressure on what we require as batteries to complete this energy transition. I mean, one thing that is very clear is mobility applications, especially something like air mobility, require very energy dense batteries. Not so much if it is a stationary storage sitting somewhere in a wasteland. I guess that's where I do see that there is a possibility of such divergence, and that would only create more diversity in what sort of future path battery chemistry can take. There could be very good learnings also. Thank you.
Absolutely. And to expand on that, so you said, one of the trade-offs between other than the cells and the cells being made into modules and packs being different for EVs versus, mobility versus storage, you're saying there could be a trade-off in the chemistry for energy density. Are there other trade-offs on the terms of, say, longevity or price or safety where we might see differences between mobility and storage?
Yeah, I mean, I can go first on that. I mean, yes, there are many different characteristics that determine what chemistry makes the most sense. And we're an agnostic company because we're not an OEM of the cells ourselves. So we're picking, even within our portfolio, the same sort of building block of our technology, the cube, can accommodate different chemistries from different suppliers. And what makes sense depends upon the market, and it depends upon even sort of project site specific or use case specific requirements. Generally, the requirements are slightly different between mobility and stationary, but I think even within mobility, right, there's a big range. Right, there are LFP EVs and so on that are being produced where the overriding objective isn't the most range per vehicle, but then there are other segments where the range is the most important thing. So there are always trade-offs of those, and I think like one of the really interesting ones, because it's not just that stationary storage can take a different path to mobility, it's also within mobility there are a lot of different strategies of how you can manage the requirements of electrification. So one really good example of this is if you look at electrification of bus fleets, you can put in very large battery packs to basically drive around those buses and recharge them essentially once a day at the end of the day at the depot. But there are other models as well, which you can achieve if you take a different chemistry. So I'm actually in Geneva at the moment. I've been at the UN Sustainable Energy Week this week, and one of the really interesting panels that was presented was by the Geneva Transport Authority, essentially. What they've put in is an electric bus fleet with LTO, lithium titanate oxide batteries, which don't then really compete because they're not the right chemistry for most applications in stationary storage. They're very good at very, very fast charging. So you can charge them at 6 or 7 C. The analogy of this was if you took a mobile phone and you plugged it in like this, I have on the side, instead of taking whatever number of hours to recharge, LTO would take about 6 or 7 minutes. So they put in much, much smaller batteries on the buses, and then they're recharging them at not every stop, but there's a number of stops around the network where they do stop and recharge. And that is quite interesting because it then isn't a competing chemistry. It's solving the problem in a different way. And there's arguments for both models, and what's right may depend even on the local authority and the bus routes and everything else. But I thought that's a really interesting example of, how we talk about batteries, but they're not one thing, right? They're many, many different flavors of subchemistry and use case.
Indeed. I guess, I would like to sort of also add a few points here. I mean, Marek already started on the whole use case part of the mobility battery debate. I mean, there is always this whole issue of whether you want integrated batteries or swappable batteries. And if you move away from the private use kind of use case, then you do see that there are amazing possibilities there. If you move away from the high voltage architecture to a low voltage one, then there is even more opportunity because batteries can actually be swapped manually. You don't need a robot. You don't need the kind of safety measures that would require you to, for example, swap a battery for a neo car in say electric two-wheeler, right? And I guess that's where I also see that this is rather interesting for us. I mean, what for example, we are doing at Ability. Our powertrain is with an integrated battery swapping mechanism, and this is applicable across various form factors: three-wheelers, two-wheelers, even some boats. And the idea there is that these are all directed towards logistics operations or last mile delivery operations, whether on road or on water. And here, this kind of use case fits right in because these operations are hub driven, right? These operations are driven by you coming back to a warehouse all the time, and that's where you can swap the batteries, put a new load in, off it goes, comes back. Yeah. So I think this is also very interesting in terms of how use case should dictate how we solve for it rather than there being a one size fit all.
Absolutely. And it's less mobility versus storage, it's mobility and storage, as you've both given examples of integrating both to find a solution to a specific problem. What I'd love for you to highlight to our audience is what is the risk of not having them working together, specifically around, overloading our existing energy grid infrastructure. Highlight that a bit, and sort of how do you see this partnership between energy and mobility and storage working together to best utilize the grids we already have?
Right. Maybe I'll start here first for a change, Marek. I
Sure.
think it's really very interesting. I mean, I had a sample of EV professionals, and I asked them the very same question: why should we not go all long on vehicle to grid? And that being in a way so well integrated with such grids that it is essentially storage on demand on wheels. And I guess one interesting sort of criticism to that is the concern around the batteries in such vehicles. With the limited number of full cycle equivalents available there, where there being an increasing trend, at least in automotive, that people now want batteries with, in fact, lesser longevity, because batteries are by far way over like surviving way more than the vehicles that are carrying them, right? So this is the reality of the situation that we have batteries that just don't die in our cars, and I guess that's where the trend that they want to take it to is to really have batteries which are just right, and therefore achieve some sort of cost advantages there. The vehicle to grid use case, on one hand, we have seen, especially in the UK, for example, there being very clear statements, sometimes, in fact, most of the times exaggerated, as to how much you can make by plugging into the grid and offering that as connected capacity, and that kind of creating a bubble and that sort of going poof now. So I guess that's really the kind of intellectual struggle that the EV space is in right now. But what one understands is that it may not be that everybody or every able body follows this as a regimen. But at a principle level, everybody understands that you cannot be in this process disabling the grid itself or kind of disrupting the grid itself. Over to you, Marek.
No, I think I agree with a lot of that. It's an interesting discussion. Like vehicle to grid, there are places where that's going to work extremely well, and then there are also places that it won't. and it comes down to use cases again, right? This is always going to go down to use cases. You in your opening remarks talked about the different uses of different types of vehicles, right? So the passenger vehicle, which drives you to work and drives you home and stays plugged in most of the time. The reason that's surviving so long and outlasting the actual vehicle chassis, which is contrary to what everyone thought, is that the cycling is so low, right? You're not even really, well, at most you'll be charging once a week, probably even less, right? So that's one cycle a week. Whereas on the grid, depending what you're doing with the battery, typically you're cycling it at least once a day. If it's a higher C-rate system, maybe it's 2 or 3 times a day. So it's a completely different degradation profile for those two different scenarios, but also the stationary batteries are set up differently for those type of applications, right? You have basically a state-of-the-art optimized thermal management cooling system, because you don't have to worry about some of those other trade-offs, things like passenger comfort or space or safety or other elements that can influence the design. Which means, so there's certain places where you might be able to make use of a vehicle to grid and compete for grid services, but there are sort of trade-offs for that, and it doesn't also work in the scenarios if you're looking at mobility where it is like more 24/7 uses, and that could be anything in the logistics space, like you talked about, where utilization is the optimum outcome. You don't want vehicles to be sitting there not doing anything, and so the swapping technology makes it quite a different scenario as well, right? Depends on if you're looking at fast charging, if something is going to be moving constantly, what do you define efficient as? I think the two interact very strongly, and often we do see actually stationary EV infrastructure, stationary storage at EV infrastructure, right? The two go hand in hand. You have a battery in the vehicles, but you also have a battery locally on the grid because of the geographic element of, if you are going to have fast charging, right, at call it a modern service station, right? Instead of a petrol or diesel refill, you have battery fast chargers. If 20 vehicles are plugged in at 600 kilowatts each, that's a huge spike of local demand. And you can manage that by putting in stationary storage at a distributed level to absorb that spike, right? It can charge up during the day and then serve the demand for a shorter, spikier period in the evening. So again, often it's usually complementary rather than in conflict.
Absolutely. So might just hand over to Simon to have a bit of a look at what our audience is asking, and would love to hear your opinions on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And hopefully my battery going to last. Battery's running out. Of course, the classic. Perfect. No, thank you so much, all of you. Maybe one quick thing I would like to, before we go to some of the questions, let's also put up a poll we ran on our LinkedIn. Again, we have one poll for each of them. Here, this was which one of these battery applications will be larger in gigawatt hours by 2030. You can see here, at least from our our respondents, we have seen mobility being strong in the lead here, and then follow up on stationary, and of course battery consumer goods being quite a bit lower. But yeah, just kind of quick reaction on this. Marek, Rajashi, does this make sense to you? Do you think differently?
I'd really like if this is the direction that it's going to take, for one simple reason, that stationary, and in that order mobility, are able to provide batteries in bulk that can go to recycling. Whereas, you look at consumer goods, one big challenge is 50% of those batteries simply get lost in the dumps, never to be recycled ever again. And they are too small to recycle in any case. So I guess that's to me is really, if this is the direction, really cool. Well, I guess stationary, I would hope that it actually picks up more than what the poll says. It's really required to even enable the mobility use case. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you make a good point there around needing recycling to get that circularity in the battery industry. Do you think that mobility or stationary will have more success in collecting those batteries for recycling than consumer electronics? And if so, why?
It's partly also what kind of regulation we are expecting, Bianca. So traceability is definitely coming up in regulations across the world, not just in the Western world. And I guess what's also really juicy is the sort of intermittent spike in materials, where it sort of becomes feasible every once in a while to actually get those materials through recycling rather than sourcing them direct. So I think this should keep I would say the momentum going. I was also checking on the investment trend, the latest VC trend in the mobility industry, and then recycling is actually the most popular, I would say, investment destination in this quarter. So I would say money is also following this direction.
Nice. And for those in the audience, we have panels both on recycling and policy later today, so stay tuned for that. Marek, I think you wanted to also add some comments?
I'm not surprised to see this order of sort of results in the poll. I sort of agree. Stationary, I mean, I don't think it's a representation of sort of the direct proportions. I think mobility will be the biggest, but stationary is going to grow in share. It needs to, essentially, to enable the mobility. Consumer goods, yeah, probably distant third. I'm very curious if anyone wants to post what the other is that they put that might be the biggest battery application, and maybe there's something we're all missing. That's sort of quite interesting to me. But yeah, otherwise, generally, I agree with the results here.
Thanks so much, Marek. And maybe just one quick follow-up question, because of course there's always people wondering, right, what might be the date when this switches, right? So I think we kind of talking this decade is really also, we can maybe see a lead for mobility, but there's also the assumption there might be, a switch when stationary will be larger than mobility, when we go fully electric for the grid. Do you have any idea, Marek, when this could be? Again, any guesses? Be good here.
Hard to say. I don't know if I would say that well, certainly not in the next 20 years. I don't think stationary will overtake mobility. It's hard to see that. I mean, again, right, the current stats, 90+% across these three is going into EVs at the moment, because it's the low-hanging fruit. It's the easiest thing to electrify. Electrifying the grid and enabling an entirely sustainable grid is the next sort of easiest low-hanging fruit, and then we get into much harder things like industry, heating, and so on, right, which is possible to electrify, or it's possible to find alternative solutions to, but that's much harder. So for those reasons, yeah, I think stationary is a huge and growing segment, particularly as you move beyond the generation piece that I talked about, or the sort of replacement of thermal grid services to actual infrastructure and transmission and distribution, particularly in mature power grids that have that backbone in the country. In places where the power grid's less mature, you might see a different model emerge that's entirely distributed. But where you have that, it makes sense to use. And so that element will grow. Maybe on the recycling point as well, right? I do think in mobility and stationary, the recycling element, one, we haven't got to that critical mass. It's just that there's not enough. Again, it's the irony that storage is lasting much longer than people predicted. There's a big difference between performance guarantees and expected performance, and a lot of people don't understand that. They'll model a guaranteed degradation curve and not realize fully that how much buffer there is in that, right? That there is likely a much better expected performance. So we don't have that volume. But because these are both business and industry related things, it's much easier to deal with legislation. We can't really control individual consumers from throwing their batteries in the bin, even if we can educate them not to do that or provide incentives not to do that. But fortunately, by volume, although we have a lot of billions of consumer electronics, by weight, by volume of raw material and everything else, stationary and mobility is definitely the larger segment.
Fantastic. No, thanks so much for sharing. Of course, you already teased on kind of some of the overlaps, right? We talking about vehicle to grid. We also had an interesting, actually, a podcast just with Battery Insiders last weekend, where we had a look at mobile stationary utility scale storage with Power Edison as well, the founders there. I mean, there's a lot of interesting concepts what coming up in it. So yeah, I very much agree on the other. Might be also very interesting to look at what people come up with, maybe the fringe areas in between. Great. Maybe just one other questions from the audience, from convergence of cell format for each application, specifically for prismatic cells. Is there anything you think these will kind of go more aligned or more diverge more? Is there where's the trend do you think it could go?
Good question. I don't know if that's a crystal ball question. Hard to say, right? There's definitely advantages in standardization, because if you have essentially swappable, I mean, prismatic was mentioned there, right? So prismatic as a building block, if all specific chemistries go to that form factor, it's easier to swap them for different applications. So there is an element of like standardization has an advantage, and it might be a VHS versus Betamax or whatever type of situation. But equally, we talked a lot about optimization for different use cases, and there are pros and cons of each of the different form factors, each of the different chemistries. So it's sort of an economies of scale and one size fits all pulling in one way, and then specialism and niches pulling in another direction. Which will win, or will it be a mix of the two? It's hard to say. I would expect there's probably both elements are going to happen simultaneously, and there's probably going to be a mass market that covers 80%, and then maybe the remaining 20% is covered by specialisms. But that's just, well, it's really a guess.
Yeah, I think I agree with Marek here. It's really a matter of choice, and it's really also a legacy effect that's building up now. So, Koreans will go with Koreans and like that. So yes, a pouch being expensive doesn't still stop some from using it. Cylindrical just happen to be, it's really not the best, most compact way of packing your cells together, but it's just, it's intuitive, and that's where a lot of us went. So I would say it's really, VHS, Betamax kind of debate.
Fantastic. Maybe in just one quick question before Bianca can close the session. I'm also looking a bit about software, because I know also that's also something which has been quite a big topic, I think, also for both of you. And of course, here kind of central software platforms, but also traceability, but also maybe the bigger question: what's the impact of software for both of these, applications? How important is it for the future?
I think it's super important for addressing the emotional argument, because most people can recognize the direct benefit of batteries, and most of the criticisms are often unfairly leveled and perhaps you would even say hypocritically leveled at looking at the battery industry or stationary storage industry and not applying those same standards to anything else in the world, right? Everything requires resources to make. Raw materials, therefore, are critical, but batteries are highly circular in terms of their ability to be recycled. And yes, it is possible to trace those and to source the raw materials that we need ethically and sustainably. I think you mentioned there are panels more on recyclability, so you might well go much deeper on this, but I'm definitely aware of some platforms. And to throw out it's not really a buzzword anymore. It was used a lot in a few years ago, but essentially blockchain is one of the applications I'm really excited about for the supply chain industry, because it really could let you properly trace not just to your supplier or your sub-supplier, all the way back to where a particular raw material came from in a traceable and unbreakable sort of way. So yes, those technologies do exist. There are companies that I'm aware of that do it. We're partnered with companies like Northvolt, which are building the first European gigafactory and places a very heavy emphasis on ESG, supply chain traceability, and lowest embodied energy, and actually making the battery cells themselves. And I think those are all really important arguments to address again, right, emotionally for the public to provide full support to the energy transition.
Yeah, I guess for me here, the bigger question is actually authenticity of data at every level. And yes, blockchain helps with keeping track of it to the point that the data point is created, that it cannot be diluted or corrupted. A centralized software would, of course, have an overview of every step in the process. But for me, the real challenge is to really tell your artisan mining versus ethical mining in DRC, in a location where it's a war zone. That's where it has always been a challenge. And you look at the case of diamonds. In effect, there are companies that made a brand out of it, but do we really know if it is what they say, and if it is exactly what they say? So I guess that to me is the bigger challenge. Software is just a layer on top. Thank you.
Absolutely, and that traceability line of thought matches what we were talking about in the first session, which is the importance of ESG to make sure that batteries contribute positively to the energy transition. A big thank you to both our panelists for your insights into mobility and stationary storage. And now we'll be closing part one for the day with some ending remarks, and then going on to the two other parts for Battery Day, which will follow after.
Thank you so much, everyone. And thank you also for Bianca. I appreciate it's getting late in Australia. No, thank you so much for leading these two fantastic panels. And then, yeah, also maybe everyone in Asia, everyone tuning in. Fantastic. If you have a bit more time in the evening, feel free to stay with us. And otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for our first part. With this, thank you all. And Amanin will come back now as well.